Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an enormous privilege to have the opportunity to talk at this event. You should know that I first met Ted Nevin on January the 4th, 1964. I was a very young, wet behind the ears economist who had just come out from my undergraduate studies. Ted Nevin was my first boss, and I was in my first ever job as a research assistant in Aberystwyth at that time. As I arrived in Aberystwyth, I did know the name Ted Nevin, but possibly not for the reasons you might expect. Specifically, I had an absolutely lousy A-level economics because I was taught by a gentleman who was a published botanist, but he knew absolutely no economics whatsoever. So when I arrived at Leeds University to study economics, I was completely fazed by the textbooks that my professors asked me to read. Samuelson and things like that. But fortunately, an illicit copy appeared one day of this book, which the gentleman here has kindly lent me. It's called A Textbook of Economic Analysis, and it's written by one Edward Nevin. It wasn't recommended at Leeds University, but I found it a goldmine because it was written clearly. And one thing I learnt about my short-to-be boss was that he wrote technical stuff in an extraordinarily clear manner. I could read this book, I could enjoy reading it, and I managed to get a degree at Leeds University, largely in the economics area, on the strength of textbook economic analysis. So that was the first thing I knew about Ted Nevin. The second thing I now say years after is I had no idea at that time, 1964, about the huge body of research that Ted had already under his belt at that time. Still a very young man, less than 40 years old. Michael's already referred to the MSc dissertation at Aberystwyth on the gilt-edged securities, the mechanism of cheap money, which is his PhD in Cambridge, the problem of national debt. These are publications that resonate today when we're studying this issue of the ballooning debt in the UK. It's half of what it was post-war, but it's a much more dangerous debt in many respects, which I brought out very clearly in Michael's excellent biography. But as someone who later, my next job after Aberystwyth was in East Africa, doing exactly the sort of job that Ted had done in Jamaica, helping as a researcher to develop the mechanisms for creating independent central bank and ending the currency board system that had also prevailed in Jamaica. And when I saw Nevin's book, Capital Funds in Underdeveloped Countries, I saw that it actually dealt with all of the issues that we ourselves faced in East Africa a few years later. These issues of stability, regulation and creation that Michael has just talked about. So this is what I knew about, what I didn't know about Ted Nevin at that time, that he'd done all this amazing amount of work. When I arrived in Aberystwyth in January '64, Ted's work on the Welsh economy was just resuming. He had started it in the 55-56 period and done the pioneering work on the initial set of national income accounts for Wales at that time. And I speculated while I was there about the reasons that had motivated Ted to switch to national income accounting and the work on the Welsh economy after he'd spent actually all of his graduate studies over 8 or 9 years on issues of monetary policy and debt issues. He had not really done any work at all on the Welsh economy until 1955. And I concluded, perhaps wrongly, this is a personal speculation, that his stay in Cambridge when he was working on cheap money must have had something to do with this. This was a time when the Keynesian revolution was still a hot topic. Cambridge at that time, two of the main disciples of the Keynesian new era were Joan Robinson and Austin Robinson and Richard Kahn, who was Ted's supervisor. Also in Cambridge at that time, we had Richard Stone and James Mead, who were the pioneers of national income accounting, both in the UK and internationally. Sir John Hicks was also there. John Hicks coined the phrase social accounting. So I conclude that Ted, in his time at Cambridge, although he did not work on this himself, must have been very, very well aware of this pioneering work in economic statistics. And it was quite natural, I think, when he showed back in Wales in Aberystwyth in the mid-1950s, that he would want to apply some of this work to a region. And the pioneering work was to apply it to a region, whereas previously it had been applied only to national economies. But whatever the reason why Ted chose to do this, by the time I got there in '64, and Ted was returning to the study of the Welsh economy after the hiatus in Jamaica and then in the Research Institute in Dublin, it was an extraordinarily fortuitous timing to go back to this type of work. Later that same year, '64, the long-standing Conservative government, which was preoccupied with the Profumo affair, heavily criticised for stop-start economic policies, fell. And Harold Wilson's government, the Labour government, was elected for the first time since early 1950s. After the election, the impetus to introduce formal economic planning in the UK came to the fore, and a new department, the Department of Economic Affairs, was quickly established under George Brown. And we saw for the first time also, the first time we saw a Welsh office created in Westminster. Ted himself was quickly asked to join a newly established Welsh Economic Council in Cardiff. So we had a new institutional, national and regional framework which was ideally suited to accommodate the work that we were then being asked to do in 1964 and onwards on the Welsh economy and the accounting for that and the statistical basis for that work. In the early years when I was there, the early months when I was there, Ted and myself basically were working on this pretty much alone, but we had the basis of the work that had been done in the middle 50s by Ted's team with people like George Peters and Elizabeth Alexandra, who had done quite a lot of the groundwork on the first set of national income accounts that was published in 1956. And my job initially was merely to try to extend that set of national income accounts to cover a full period up to and including 1964. I was constantly grateful doing that because I was a complete beginner. I didn't have much clue what I was doing, to be honest. And I was replicating what George Peters and others had done 5 or 6 years earlier. I gradually learned about it and learned how to do it. But Ted was always there looking over my shoulder and giving me a great deal of encouragement. It was also very encouraging to me to embark on studies for what was initially a PhD, and he encouraged me to study the personal savings behaviours in the Welsh economy, which I can talk about not now, but on another occasion. Fortunately, my own very limited efforts in these regards were greatly fortified in 1965 when the team, now renamed the Economic Research Unit, was joined by Jeff Round, my colleague here, who will speak to you in a moment. Jeff came with a much stronger mathematical background than me. He was very well qualified in computer programming, so we were able to move the agenda on from simply putting the statistics together and the primitive input-output to creating a much more sophisticated version of an input-output table for Wales, which creates and it drills down deeply into the structure of the national income accounts to show the sectoral differences of different parts of the economy, like the coal and the steel industry and the other sectors. And we begin to use that with Jeff's considerable help to do some very primitive modelling of the Welsh economy and how the Welsh economy was interacting at that time with the rest of the UK, and how the national plan, which was going to be produced by the Department of Economic Affairs, would reflect on what was going to most likely to happen in Wales in terms of employment and other matters. Jeff will say much more about that in a moment. Our unit was established in an old building called Pen Rock. Some of you may know it, in Aberystwyth, literally a stone's throw from the pier. We had a lovely second floor view over the ocean and down the promenade of Aberystwyth, and we had a lovely little cheap Chinese restaurant underneath the building. The small group of us that were assembled by Ted at that time, about 5 or 6 of us initially, were all pretty young. I think we were all unmarried, and so we were anxious for a decent social life as well as for the economic experience. And Ted himself was still young enough, I'm glad to say, still under 40, to maintain a pretty relaxed attitude to our goings-on, and indeed was often the instigator of some of the things that we got up to. The most memorable was the the frequent occasions on which day's work was interrupted at 11 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon with the suggestion from the boss that we should all head off to a local pub to continue our conversations there rather than in the office. Such excursions were always, of course, enjoyable. Just occasionally, only very occasionally, they led to some new ideas, but it was part of the atmosphere of the time that we could do this. We all respected the huge sort of intellect that Ted demonstrated on a daily basis, but we never felt daunted by him. We never felt, in some sense, put down by a hierarchical system. We were part of a team, and he was the boss of the team and much respected. Jeff will tell you a lot more about the significant discussions that we had from time to time with the politicians, the Welsh office, but above all with Gwynfor Evans, who many of you will remember was the first Plaid Cymru MP to be elected to Westminster. Gwynfor, among other politicians, was quite keen on using our research results, but had a tendency to politicise them and somewhat misinterpret them, and Jeff will tell you a little more about that. But let me just mention one anecdote. A role I was asked to play by Ted. He rang me up early one morning and said, exciting news, Gwynfor Evans has just been elected to Westminster, first Plaid Cymru MP, the precursor, if you like, I suppose, of the Welsh office that was created quite a few years later. And he said, the BBC want me to go down to Carmarthen immediately to interview him. Ted did a lot of work, as you possibly know, as a commentator, and occasionally took on other roles for BBC Wales. And he said, I need a driver. I've got to get to Carmarthen in a hurry. Can you drive me down so I can sit in the back of the car and prepare my talk or my questions? So, of course, I agreed happily to do that. And I spent an unbelievably memorable day in Carmarthen with huge crowds outside Gwynfor Evans' house, imbibing this atmosphere, this euphoric atmosphere of the first sort of Welsh nationalist MP to be elected. And unfortunately, spent a little bit more time in the pubs around Carmarthen also, trying not to drink too much beer because I knew I had to get Ted safely home to his children in the evening, which I did manage to do. Ted was, in general, to generalise this a little bit more, he was clearly not slow to use his young researchers to take on tasks that had little real connection with our research activities. Michael's biography of his father recalls the occasion when Ted Davis, another young Aberystwyth colleague at that time, was press-ganged, Michael's words, into rescuing him, Michael, from Cadair Idris when he got separated from his school party. I have a similar experience. I was asked on one occasion to drive to Stonyhurst College in Lancashire. One of your brothers, I think, was a student there to deliver a package. So off I went, driving up to Stonyhurst College in Lancashire and spending a very memorable day after that in Liverpool. I'll tell you about that over our dinner tonight, because it's not appropriate for this forum now. Today's, I think, unpolitely called snowflake generation might regard such treatment by their boss as being exploitative, but we, for our part, rather enjoyed it. Ted was a very kind-hearted boss. He treated us well, we worked hard for him, and he worked hard for us. And if occasionally we were asked to do these little extraneous jobs, we did not complain too hard about that. Finally, if I may, a personal digression which illustrates another aspect of my gratitude to Ted for the support he gave me as a very young researcher 61 years ago. One other aspect of the Harold Wilson government that was elected in 1964 was that he created quite quickly a Ministry of Overseas Development, which had formerly been part of the Foreign Office, as it now is. We've abandoned DFID and we've created the FCDO, which is a retrograde step, in my humble personal opinion. This new ministry was headed initially by a name that you'll all recognise, or many of you of a certain age will recognise, Barbara Castle. She became the first Minister of Overseas Development in 1964, and almost her first ever overseas trip was to Tanzania. And she went to Tanzania and she met Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, a country that had been independent for about 6 months. and she offered him a team of British experts to help him start and develop Tanzania's first 5-year economic plan. Barbara Castle came back and the team was assembled. George Clayton, Professor George Clayton, who was Ted's colleague in Aberystwyth, was asked to join this team. But he said he'd only do it if he could take a research assistant with him. There then followed a little bit of a standoff between George Clayton and Ted Nevin, because George wanted me to go and Ted Nevin wanted me to stay to complete the work on the National Income Accounts of Wales. In the end, George won, and Ted graciously agreed that I could go to Tanzania with George Clayton. So in May 1965, George and myself boarded a VC-10 to Dar es Salaam, and 36 hours later I found myself sitting in State House, Dar es Salaam, meeting Julius Nyerere, wearing a Harris tweed jacket because that's all I had, and I didn't realise that colonial weather is a little bit hotter than Welsh weather. George Clayton stayed just 2 weeks. And they dropped news on me that I was then expected to stay in Dar es Salaam on my own as a representative of this team for 4 months, which I duly did. They gave me an office in the Treasury, Ministry of Finance. I was there for 4 months trying to hold the fort for this expert mission. We eventually produced a report called the Ross Commission Report, which I think Nyerere found moderately useful. But for me, this was, of course, wonderful experience. It took me away from what I was supposed to be doing, which was helping Jeff and Ted produce the National Income Accounts for Wales. But it basically found the basis of my lifelong interest and career, spent working mainly on issues of development, including, I might say, in Tanzania, at a slightly later date, doing a similar job to your father in the development of a new independent central bank for Tanzania, and the closing down of the old colonial currency board system. And your comments on the West African system are very pertinent, because there were lots of reasons why Britain benefited greatly from the maintenance of a currency board system which tied the Tanzanian currency to the British pound, and it was a bit of a struggle to break away from that and do the various things that were required. And as I said earlier in my talk, it was quite illuminating to realise that Ted Nevin, in his book on capital funds in underdeveloped countries, had basically resolved or dealt with all the component issues that were associated with this institution building in a country like Tanzania, that was breaking away from a colonial control system. I went back to Wales. Fortunately, I was there long enough then to work with Jeff and Ted to complete the work that I had been paid to do, and we published in due course the book that became my first ever publication, albeit a joint one, the structure of the Welsh economy, something of which I'm very proud. I remain grateful to this day for the opportunity I had as a very green beginner to work on this project. I'm grateful to Ted more generally for the support he gave me, not only on the work on Wales, but on my own sort of interest and career, and a set of experiences that, although they took place 61 years ago, I will long and happily remember. Thank you very much.